Every sales job I've ever had, I can maybe cover, let's say 200 accounts in a year because there's 5, 10 individuals in each account that I need to call 15 times each. And instead of having 200 amazing accounts that were hand selected by RevOps with all this data, I just get 2,000 junk accounts that were downloaded from a tool like ZoomInfo based on some really cursory filter criteria, let's click these industries and click this revenue range and done. Okay, cool. I now have one of two choices as a salesperson. I can either go become a data analyst and then I'm not selling anything, or I can just start banging the phone and making calls to inferior prospects, which is by definition going to get an inferior outcome. Salesforce had an army of people doing this stuff. And if an organization doesn't and they just expect the SDR manager to figure it out from zero, that is just wholly unrealistic. Either the team is not executing the right process or that process isn't working. And so what we see again and again and again is we always start off with, do we have the right process in place and is that being executed consistently? If it's not, then that's the reason why the SDR team isn't hitting their targets. Welcome to Go-to-Market Science. In this podcast, we share tangible, actionable playbooks from the trenches, working as go-to-market strategy and RevOps consultants for our clients here at Union Square Consulting, and candid conversations with revenue leaders in the market that have been there. Now let's get into it.
Today, we're talking about what to do when your SDR team isn't working. So before you fire your SDR leader, swap out your data provider, or change your cadence software, have you actually looked at what's underneath? In this episode, we're breaking down exactly how to diagnose and fix what could be going on before making those expensive changes. My name's Rachael Bueckert. I'm the marketing manager here at Union Square Consulting, and I'm here today with Eddie Reynolds, our CEO and founder. Hey, Eddie.
How's it going? I love that we're starting a podcast with let's talk about firing people. And it's so funny because I was on the phone with a PE firm that's invested in one of our customers yesterday, and he was asking me how often do you suggest that this person or that person should get fired? I'm not really having those kinds of conversations. But I just thought it was yesterday's conversation was funny, and then that opener was funny. But it is important. And actually, I think what I'm going to end up doing is probably defending the SDR manager quite a bit here in this podcast. But yeah, people do get fired when they're not hitting targets. And what we're trying to talk about here today is, what do you do when the SDR team isn't hitting their targets? So I'm excited to dive into that.
Yeah, I think with all the pressure from above, maybe revenue leaders, CROs feel like I got to make a change and this is the easiest change to make. Just get them out, get somebody new in, and pray that it works out better.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not hitting numbers, just fire the person and replace them. And it's a magic bullet to solve all problems in business.
Absolutely. Nothing will go wrong that way. All right. So, Eddie, what are you seeing out there right now in the SDR landscape?
Oh, man. Big, loaded question. Well, how much am I seeing in the SDR landscape? I mean, I think I'm seeing the same thing that everybody else is seeing. I'll be candid to our listeners. I'm not sitting in calls with SDR managers and CROs multiple times every day, seeing problems that are, super persistent in the middle of February in 2026. So I want to be careful and not answer your question and pretend to be this expert with all this detailed knowledge. I don't have the stats in front of me. I'm not having these conversations every day. More what I'm seeing is that, with our customers, we see common challenges that people are struggling with. I've got 25 years of experience being in sales and working with sales leaders and revenue leaders, et cetera, and I've seen a lot of stuff over the years. And then thirdly, of course, I'm aware of the macroeconomic stuff where outbound is really challenging. There's all this pressure to use AI, and the SDR role, and then kind of by extension the SDR manager, are two of the hardest roles in go-to-market, and they're also two of the most valuable. And so you're going to see me share a lot of empathy for the SDR manager in this podcast. And what we're going to talk about today are the specific operational challenges that we're seeing again and again and again that contribute to said SDR manager missing their target. That's the thing that we're focused on. And if you want to know what percentage of SDR managers are missing target, you can find that elsewhere. Or Rachel, you just wrote up this amazing report on the state of go-to-market that I read this morning that's going to go out, and there might be some stuff in there, but I'm not going to pretend like I have all those stats in my back pocket.
That's fair. So when a CRO comes to you and they say my SDR team isn't working, what does that usually mean? And what are they actually describing?
So what they mean when they say that it's not working is that they're not hitting targets. They're not generating enough pipeline or by extension enough revenue. to meet the targets that the company has. But like, what's behind that, right? Let's break this down into two components. And like, scientifically, mathematically, however we call it, there's only one of two things that could be happening. Either the team is not executing the right process, or that process, using air quotes for right, isn't working. And so what we see again and again and again is, like, we always start off with, do we have the right process in place, and is that being executed consistently? If it's not, then that's the reason why the SDR team isn't hitting their targets. It might be the wrong process, but if we're not even executing it correctly, we won't know. So let's use a tangible example from one of our customers. So we had this classic issue with like sales and marketing misalignment. We've talked about this on podcasts in the past, and customer came to us like, hey, like, we've got all these leads we're sending over to sales. Sales isn't calling them. Marketing says that, the leads aren't converting because sales doesn't do their job. Sales says that they don't want to call these leads because they're worthless. It's the classic story. So like, how do we approach this? Well, we sat down with them and we mapped out the process. What exactly do we need in order to make outbound successful? We have this outlined in our go-to-market efficiency pyramid, as well as our modern outbound framework, and we're updating that shortly. But first, like, what are our ICP and buyer personas by product if we have multiple products? Second, like, what is that outbound process? Do we have capacity-based territory plans? Meaning, like, have we identified the best possible accounts for our reps, for our SDRs, that fit within the amount of accounts or contacts or prospects that they can actually work in a given period of time? I really harp on that a lot, because every sales job I've ever had, I can maybe cover, let's say, 200 accounts in a year, because there's like, 5, 10 individuals in each account that I need to call 15 times each. So just basic math, like, that's how many accounts I can cover in a year. And instead of having 200 amazing accounts that were like hand selected by RevOps with all this data, I just get 2,000 like junk accounts that were like downloaded from a tool like ZoomInfo based on like some really cursory filter criteria, like, let's click these industries and click this revenue range and done. Okay, cool. I now have one of two choices as a salesperson. I can either go become a data analyst, which is essentially what I did and led me to this like role in my life right now, and then I'm not selling anything. Or I can just like start banging the phone and making calls to inferior prospects, which is by definition going to get an inferior outcome. So either way, you end up losing a lot of valuable selling time not calling the best accounts, because you have to choose between being an analyst and calling the wrong accounts. So like, that's something I'm really big on. And then what is the step-by-step process? Are we going to email 5 times, call 5 times, send 5 LinkedIn messages? Are we going to send a care package in the mail? Like, what is that process step by step? How do we do it? Like, how much research needs to be done? Do we go to the website? Do we spend a couple minutes looking at these things? Do we use templated messaging? Do we tweak that messaging? Like, what is that step-by-step process? And this isn't rocket science. Any company that has a full SDR team knows exactly what it takes to reach out to a great prospect and turn that into a meeting. The problem is they haven't codified it, and their reps, especially like newbie SDRs, are not doing that thing. And then we need to build that into the systems. We need to drive them to adopt that process. So this is exactly what we did with this particular customer. And they actually didn't have an SDR team. So we talked to them about building one. They built one. We helped codify that process with them. Marketing sent all the leads over to the SDRs. The SDRs called 15 times or however many times it was. And then they got a big donut for a result. So, okay, cool. Like, we got them executing the process. Mission failed. No pipeline. Well, what we did with them is we actually shifted them over to outbound and said, well, like, what's the outbound process? Like, who should we be reaching out to? What's the step-by-step process, et cetera, like I just went over. And within weeks, they were generating hundreds of thousands of dollars of qualified pipeline. So that like is a pretty scientific way to validate that those marketing leads were not good. And we're talking about going from inbound SDRs to outbound SDRs. The inbound process failed, the outbound process worked, and it's easy to pivot back to inbound and just say, okay, we just need to raise the bar. Like, what is different about these cold prospects that allowed them to be converted into meetings and qualified pipeline, where these warm leads, I use warm in air quotes, did not convert? Well, clearly we need to raise the bar on our MQLs, right? So I don't want to like just kind of go down a rabbit hole for a half an hour and ramble, but that's like the fundamental answer to your question of like, what do we do when things aren't working? We have to figure out and isolate the issue. If you think of a chain of events, it's like, well, we have the process, we have the execution, and then we have the effectiveness of that execution. And until we're actually executing consistently, we can't know if that process is effective. So we got to go execute first, and then we can rinse and repeat and figure out what's working and what's not.
And you mentioned the SDRs have the toughest job. Can you build the case for that? What's going on with them? Why is that? Why is their job so hard?
I mean, anybody who's ever spent like a day in sales knows like nobody wants to prospect. It's miserable. It's difficult. I mean, like I've even enjoyed prospecting from time to time. But it's just like, it's the least pleasant activity in sales, right? The most pleasant is that you just show up to meetings and you ask questions and you do some presentations. And that's just like set up for you. And so like, this is where we have like turned as an industry into like these AEs that are just fed all day long. I've never personally had that job. Sounds really nice. I've always had to prospect, including like starting my own company. I still prospect today. But yeah, it just sounds really nice to just get fed leads and I just show up to like pre-scheduled meetings. The alternative to spend all day, every day, just hammering the phones can be miserable, especially if you're not like achieving your results. I mean, it's really, really tough. It's demoralizing. That's the most important and the hardest thing. Like any organization, if they can set up meetings with the right people that convert into qualified pipeline and close one business, if they can do that at scale, you have, I mean, truly at scale, you have $1 billion company. I mean, this is kind of how Salesforce started. You know, they kind of wrote the book on it. It's a bit outdated. And there's some stuff in there that worked for them at that time that doesn't work now. I'm talking about predictable revenue for anybody that's not familiar with what I'm talking about. But like, in a way, it's a magic bullet. It's so incredibly hard. But if you can find a way to just book an infinite number of meetings with the right people, then you have a magic bullet for generating revenue, so long as the rest of your process isn't broken. And so it's the hardest and most valuable thing in go-to-market. And most people that spend 12 to 18 months just banging the phones all day, every day, getting hung up on and cursed out, like they want to go into the AE role. Oftentimes they want to go into it prematurely. They're not ready for the AE role. There are stats that I'm aware of that like a lot of SDRs promoted AEs fail miserably because they're just so anxious to get out of this miserable job. And then, you know, they're the least experienced people in the organization. And so it's really tough. Like it's their first job out of college. Oftentimes they're trying to learn everything about working, about the product, about the company, about the prospect. They've got no context. They're 22 years old. They're calling into a 40, 50, 60-year-old decision maker that, you know, doesn't respect them or think that they have any idea what they're talking about. And they're probably right most of the time. It's just a really, really tough job. And then the SDR manager by extension is similar. I mean, like by definition, the SDR manager is the most junior person on the management team, right? Oftentimes these people were star SDRs, or maybe they became an account executive and then they became an SDR manager, but like you don't typically see somebody become like a sales manager, VP of sales, CRO, and then go to become an SDR manager. So they're the most junior manager. And so by definition, I mean, we see this problem with VPs of sales and CROs too. You know, just because you're good at like you're a good SDR, or you're a good AE doesn't mean that you know how to build repeatable process and get your team to execute it consistently. Those are two very different things. And so it's kind of like this idea of like, you know, am I a coach or an architect? Like, is it my job as an SDR manager to like sit down with my SDR and encourage them and teach them how to make a cold call and, you know, help them like learn and grow? Yes. But is it also my job to build a repeatable system that is going to work at scale? Yes. But like, do I have the experience to do that just because I crushed my quota for 18 months as an SDR or as an AE? Probably not.
So, if this role is so important, why do you think so many companies and CROs are quick to turn over the team or the leader when things aren't going well?
I mean, I think like there's this thought process that you should hire these people that can just figure it out. And I see this problem like being rampant across all of go-to-market, across all levels, from startups to giant enterprises, where there is this belief system that if we just bring in the right leader, that they can figure out all problems, they'll solve everything, and then we will hit our target. And a lot of times we're setting these leaders up for failure. And I would say a few things about that. I mean, like as somebody who's done this myself, like starting my own company, there's some truth to that. I've built a company from nothing with $200 into a real enterprise that's profitable and cash flow positive. But did I do that along a timeline that was decided by someone else while answering to someone else while getting a paycheck and not like, you know, ownership of a company? They're two totally different things, right? So like, could I have done exactly what I did? Like, let's just assume that I'm an A player, and I'm not trying to be egotistical. It's just for the sake of like example here. Let's assume like I'm an A player, leader, whatever. It's one thing to go do it for myself when I have like this infinite timeline. It's another thing like for someone else to hire me and it's their baby and it's not mine, and the whole and there's all this stuff that's completely screwed up and I'm trying to fix it, and I'm being like held accountable to hit this target within 12 months. That's a whole different thing. And so I think across the entire spectrum with revenue leadership, people are brought in and they're told you need to hit this target. And there's so many things that are broken, like this operational framework we talk about here. We maybe don't even know our ICP. We haven't defined it well enough. We haven't defined the process. We're hiring an SDR manager that doesn't have the experience to figure that out on their own. If they did, they probably wouldn't be interviewing for their first SDR manager role. They'd probably be interviewing for a VP of sales role or a CR role, or potentially their second CRO role. Like, you've got to learn this stuff somehow, right? And so we're just going to bring them in and give them a target. And like, if you don't hit this, like, you're fired, when in fact, and I've been in this situation many times, we're calling the wrong customer because we haven't bothered to define it. And who's going to figure out who the right customer is? Some new SDR manager that just came to the organization and is still figuring out where the bathroom is, or like the founder, CEO, CRO, et cetera, that have been around forever and should know exactly who the ideal customer is. And if they took a little bit of time to sit back and say, oh, wow, we need to define this more than just like what industries are they in and what revenue range are they in. We need to look at our data and be really thoughtful about who we're targeting, and build this process out like I explained earlier in the podcast. Then we're going to set this person up for success. And then if they can't motivate their SDRs to make the calls, if they can't coach them, we can kind of narrow in and say, like, these are reasonable expectations of like a first-time SDR manager, and you're not meeting those expectations. And so we have to either coach you up or coach you out. Okay, cool. But don't hire any leader in an organization. I don't care if it's an SDR manager, a CRO, a CMO, a CFO, whatever, and just expect that they can like solve all your problems overnight just because you think you pay them enough money to do so. It's just not realistic. I wish it was. I would be like, sipping Mai Tais on the beach. I would hire that person. But A, it's not realistic. And it's just not realistic.
And we gave a brief, like an overview of all this earlier in the podcast, like you said, but let's dig into that a little bit deeper now. What's the first thing you would want a CRO to look into when they're facing this, knowledge and skill gap with their SDR leaders, and they need to fix it, and they don't want to fire their team right away? They want to see what could be going on at a deeper level.
Well, maybe from that perspective, I'll share what I saw at Salesforce. So I know Salesforce is a giant enterprise that's also not doing that well right now. And if you're like in an organization that's got like 20 salespeople, it's kind of hard to compare. But I think that there's some comparisons that are really, really valuable for a small company to make. And so when I look at Salesforce, I had like 5 or 6 or 7 layers of sales management between me and the CEO. It's a huge company, right? Now, like, of course, like a smaller company is not going to have these layers, but what I think is relevant is like, what do they do at these layers? So you start off as an AE and then you get promoted to a manager. And then from there, you get promoted to an area vice president and then an SVP and an EVP, et cetera. Well, like what is the AVP doing with their frontline sales managers or RVPs as they're oftentimes called? Well, like they're coaching like people on how to coach, right? Like they are trying to like take somebody who was just an account executive and they're in their first time as a manager and say like, this is how you manage a team. You've learned how to sell and you did really well at that. And that's why we promoted you. That doesn't mean you know how to manage. Now, then you go to the AVP role. Now you're learning how to manage managers. That's a different skill set that you now have to learn from your SVP and so on and so forth. At Salesforce, you have to go quite high up the chain and or into a different department before you get into like operations and the people that are actually designing the process. So especially like this is really relevant if somebody wants to hire somebody from Salesforce, which at least back when they were doing better in the market, everybody did. It's like all this stuff is designed for you. People always talk about how like these leaders, like, oh, they're going to come with the playbook. They didn't invent that playbook. Someone else invented it, right? So when I was at Salesforce, they already had a playbook for every single sales role and management role across the entire organization that was developed by somebody that like nobody that I worked with ever met, maybe the executive that I reported under, right? So when you think about like, what is that methodology? Like on the cold calling side, like shout out to John Barrows, who I've been talking to recently to help us find our new amazing podcast agency. he provided all the training for our outbound, and it's like, here's the step-by-step process. And then Salesforce codified that. They gave us like online training. They had systems built in Salesforce. They had reporting for it. Like they had everything. Like, this is who you should be calling. This is how you research. Everything that I laid out was already designed. Do you think my sales manager designed that or knew how to design that, or even his boss or his boss? No. So now that person that was an AE at Salesforce or an SDR at Salesforce goes into this like startup or scale up, and they're an SDR manager, and now all of a sudden like the Salesforce playbook doesn't work because they're selling something totally different, and they've got to adjust it. That's not their job. Like, not to pitch our services, but like that is why you have a VP of RevOps to sit down and help design that. Even a lot of CROs don't have that. And the CROs that know how to do that usually are working in organizations that are too large to allow for them to spend their time on that. So that's where they delegate that to like a VP of RevOps, and they say, look, like, I know what good looks like and I know how we need to do this, but like actually putting hands on keyboards and codifying this into like process documents and training manuals, and then building this into like all of our systems and building out the reports. I know that I need a report that shows me ABC. I know that I want my sales managers to be looking at these reports to hold their team accountable to execute this process, but it's a ton of work to get that done. So unfortunately, shameless plug for our services, Salesforce had an army of people doing this stuff. And if an organization doesn't, and they just expect the SDR manager to figure it out from zero, that is just wholly unrealistic. What they should expect that SDR manager to do, especially first time, is like, hey, look, you know how to sell, or at least you as a successful SDR, know how to like prospect and set up meetings. Your primary job is to coach and encourage your SDRs to do the same. So help them do that. We've got training and enablement to help you. We've got RevOps to help you. We've codified these systems. We've built all this stuff out so that you can do your job. And then we are going to teach you as an SDR manager how to do that, how to be a manager. That is the role of the CRO in this instance, unless there's some other person between the CRO and the SDR manager. That is a realistic expectation of someone. But asking them to like design the system from zero with no experience doing that is unrealistic. Quick pause. If you're getting value from this episode, I want to ask you a small favor. Take 30 seconds right now, open up the app you're listening to this on, and give us a 5-star rating. It sounds small, but it's the single biggest thing you can do to help us get conversations like this in front of more revenue leaders. While you're there, hit follow so you never miss an episode. Okay, let's get back into it.
So let's talk about the fundamentals of that playbook that you just mentioned a little bit deeper. The things that need to be in place before you can even evaluate whether your SDR team is performing or whether somebody needs to get fired or tools need to change. You mentioned ICP, persona definitions, account capacity, target list quality, segmentation, messaging, all that stuff. So let's start with ICP and buyer personas. What's the difference between a company that has this nailed and one that just thinks that they do?
Specificity. The company that has it nailed is extremely specific about lots of different criteria. Some of that criteria can be run through tools like ZoomInfo or Clay or a combination thereof so that they can get like a more refined list. Some of that specificity you will only see once the rep is actually looking at the website and researching it. And that also depends on, the cost of the solution being sold and how much time you can justify for a rep to do account research before, starting to make calls. But that specificity is at the heart of like how narrowly you can focus. So if I say our ICP is, and I'm like, this is a literal example that I've pulled from, a company that I've been working with. Our ICP are these 14 industries. Every company in that industry that's in North America that has revenue above $1 million. Okay. Like there's 33 million companies in America, and you just described like 3 million of them. And you have 5 SDRs to call 3 million companies and 10 individuals in each company. So 30 million people. Like it's just completely unrealistic. So, and I think most companies fall victim to this. Like you wrote a report that we're going to publish soon. And I forget the exact stat that you put into that report that you found from other reports that you aggregated, showing that I think it was only 23% of pipeline across the B2B SaaS industry currently is, ICP fit, meaning that like these SDRs that are setting up these meetings are handing these deals over to AEs, and 3 out of 4 of these deals are with companies that are not in the ICP. And that's probably a vague definition of ICP, not what I'm describing. So what I'm saying is get laser focused. If you've got 5 SDRs or 50 SDRs, what is every single data point, both qualitative and quantitative, we can use to identify the absolute best prospects that fit into the narrow number of accounts or prospects that our SDRs can call on? That, and also according to the report that I've been saying this for a while, but this is in the report that you're writing, that is one of the biggest unlocks, right? Like just by definition, if I call an ICP fit account, the conversion rate from cold call to meeting to pipeline to closed one is going to be significantly higher than anyone else by definition, because that's what makes it ICP, right? And if we don't know what our ICP is, we look at that data and reverse engineer it, right? So like that's the biggest unlock. And then the next piece is, are we executing the right process to convert those prospects?
And from that report that you mentioned, they also said there's eight times more or 8 times higher sales efficiency in those instances where they had high ICP fit accounts that they were going after. So this is really important.
It's not a surprise. Like I remember when I was at Salesforce, and I think they could have done a better job of this, but I remember like one day I just got an email and there's like, here's the 6 codes and NIAX codes of like all the, industries that we sell best into. And it was like, oh, surprise, surprise. Like we do best with B2B SaaS. And I was like, oh, wow, it's funny that like all my like highest, paying customers, the ones that like have the most adoption of Salesforce are all in B2B SaaS. And it's like, well, and then I had a pretty narrow revenue range that I covered as well, and also a pretty narrow geographic range. So it's like, okay, well, who am I going to call? I'm going to call B2B SaaS companies first before I go and call on like air conditioning manufacturers, which is funny because I actually had an air conditioning manufacturer that I tried to do a deal with. And this brings up my point of segmentation. The air conditioning manufacturer, I have no idea how that works. They were doing commercial air conditioning manufacturing, and I think they came inbound. And I was like scrambling. I'm like, I need to find a Salesforce partner that knows this industry. I need to find use cases. Like I spent hours and hours and hours just trying to prepare for my first meeting because I was like, I know nothing about commercial air conditioning manufacturing. And I see company after company after company that take their reps, whether they're SDRs or AEs, and they're like, you're going to call into these 25 different industries. And every single time you pick up the phone or you write an email, you're going to be talking to a different, role in a different industry. And so like, email number 1, I need to email the CFO in a commercial air conditioning manufacturing company, and I have to figure out what messaging is going to resonate with that person. And then I switch, and now I have an email to the VP of marketing in a B2B SaaS company, and I got to figure out what messaging is going to resonate with that person. So we're big on segmenting because, like, first of all, if you narrow the focus and just say, look, like these 1, 2, 3 industries, or this one industry is where we play best, great. Now reps can spend all day thinking about just that one industry or those 3 industries. Here are the personas that are absolute best for us. Now I can only think about these folks, right? And then if I batch them together, like as an SDR, I can spend all day or all week or whatever period of time only focused on this one buyer, only focused on trying to figure out the messaging that's going to work with this one buyer, on taking the templates that are provided to me, which is also more focused because we have less templates to create that are specific to that segment that are already going to perform better because they're tailored to that segment. And then do I want to personalize these or customize these to make it like really relevant to that particular buyer? If I have to bounce around across 15 different industries and 15 different types of buyers all in one day, like there's just 0 chance that I'm going to do that well.
And piggybacking off what you're saying about like, our best segments and our best buyers and customers, like, does your company have the feedback loop capabilities in your systems or meetings or however you do things to get feedback from customer success and from marketing to ensure that the people you're selling to are your actual ICPs and buyer personas? Or are you chasing people who actually churn very frequently or are really, really hard to expand into?
That's a really, really great point. And it's a case for having really clean data and making sure you're capturing the right data in the sales cycle so that when customers onboard and go through the, customer journey, you can see which customers are playing out well and which are not. The good news though is you can also just take all of your closed won deals and backfill and augment that data with tools like ZoomInfo, Clay, et cetera, and then say, okay, like maybe we have like really crap data, but we know like, cause they signed a contract and they give it, they pay our invoices. we know like the company's legal name and address and stuff. And so we can cross-reference that against these databases, and we can figure out what is their revenue range, what is their industry, what is their subsector, what tech stack are they using, what's their headcount, like what funding do they have, like what's their growth rate, what geography are they in. And the thing that I think is really interesting about ICP is when you really do a good job of this, you get into like weird stuff, right? So like the two examples that like always come to mind is like when I was at Salesforce and I was trying to sell their marketing tool, which was at that time called Pardot, competitor HubSpot. It's like, don't try to sell this tool to companies with shitty websites, right? Like it's $20,000 a year tool. If I open up a prospect or customer's website and it looks like they spent $500 on their website 10 years ago, and we also had a tool that would show us like what kind of trackers they have on. So for example, if they're using HubSpot, they'd be tracking the visit. I could see that with in my web browser. Well, like, who do you think you want to sell a $20,000 marketing tool to? Probably not a company that thinks that their investment in marketing involves a $500 website that's 10 years out of date, right? Another example of this is like with us, like when we're selling our strategic services, we have to align like philosophically with the CRO. That's unfortunately not something that I can like pump through ZoomInfo or Clay. And when we're talking with folks, it's like, are they interested in building a scalable, repeatable motion? If so, they're going to value what we do with our strategic consulting, meaning specifically bringing in experienced VPs of RevOps that understand go-to-market and not just building systems. If they don't appreciate that, then the best that we can hope for is to sell them like outsourced Salesforce architecture and admin services. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But like that for us is like within the first meeting, you can tell that. And if you've really clearly defined your ICP, then you can design your sales process around that to discover these things up front. And when I'm talking to a CRO, like the first thing I'm trying to figure out is, do they want to build an engine, or do they just want to like slap tools together and say like, like here's a classic example. They come to us and say like our SDR team isn't working. Well, what's the solution to that? Do they want to like sit down and define the ICP and the process and, you know, get the systems in place and get the reporting in place and do all the things we recommend? Or do they just want to like implement Apollo really quickly and get their team to be banging out 100 calls a day? Okay, cool. I mean, we could do either thing, but if we try to pitch the strategic stuff to the CRO that just wants to bang 100 calls a day and implement Apollo in the next week and a half, they're just not going to value it. And that's like this like really subtle nuance that I think a lot of companies are lacking. And I could spend months trying to convince a CRO to like drink our Kool-Aid, and they're just not going to do it.
And I think some of the best clients that we've had are, you know, CROs that we don't have to instruct too much on strategy because they already have their strategies and they're already aligned philosophically with us, like you said. They just need, you know, more resources to execute the projects and the vision that they have in their head. And then we can just, you know, tag along and do that, or tag on to their team and do that.
Yeah. And a lot of that stems from like these people having worked at other organizations, like, you know, where I worked at Salesforce, and they've seen the show and they're like, oh, this is how go-to-market operates. Like I need this in my new organization that I've just joined. Which is interesting. Like I literally just light bulb came on in my own head. I'm like, what if we targeted CROs that worked at like certain organizations previously? Like that could be a data point that we could use ourselves. And without really thinking hard about your ICP, you're going to miss those data points, which is going to influence everything downstream for outbound and all of go-to-market. But I feel like we've harped a lot on ICP, and we should probably move on.
We should. I mean, ICP is super, super important. So I'm happy talking a lot about it, but we should move on to the next thing. All right, let's talk a little bit about account capacity. So how many accounts an SDR can actually work without skipping steps needed to close those accounts. So Eddie, how do you figure out what that number is? And is there an easy way to calculate it?
Yeah. Let me just use a tangible example from my experience at Salesforce. So when I was there, I was like technically on the SMB team. I think for a lot of companies who I was selling into, it would be considered mid-market. These were organizations with, you know, 20 to 200 employees, oftentimes like tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions in venture capital, you know, sub or over 100 million in revenue. And but the process at Salesforce was like fairly enterprise. It's kind of interesting. Like it's weird to say that I was like in SMB sales, because it's not anything like what I see in SMB sales in other organizations. And I say all this to like paint a picture of what like my capacity looked like. So if I'm reaching out to an organization for Salesforce, as an example, let's start by thinking like, how many different people might I want to reach out to? Of course, I could reach out to the VP of sales or the CRO. That's an obvious one. Then you have the head of customer success. You have the COO, which is actually we found to be a better role for us selling like our service tools. You have the chief marketing officer. Of course, we're going to sell marketing tools to that person. You have the CFO that was always involved in a lot of decisions, influenced a lot of decisions. You have the CEO, of course, because these organizations are still small enough that the CEO will participate in evaluations. You have the Salesforce admin. Potentially you have an implementation partner if they're an existing customer of Salesforce. You have like the office manager, and then you have other executives in the organization. For example, I sold into a couple of research organizations, and there were people like that managed all of the analysts, and there was a play for us to sell Salesforce to like 200 analysts. So you have all of these different roles, which kind of rounds out to like, let's just call it eight people. So then you say, okay, like, let's just say that I want to make 20 calls a day. So the process is I'm going to go in, I'm going to look at the company's website, I'm going to do like a fair amount of research, and then I'm going to tailor my outreach. Now, keep in mind, I was there 10 years ago. We got AI tools that can make us more productive now. But the bottom line is like, without skipping steps, I could probably do 20 to 30 activities in a day. And when I say activities, I'm talking about reaching out to one customer. We could double that number and call it 60 if I'm like sending an email and like, or leaving a voicemail and following up with an email, whatever. But the point is like, I'm reaching out to, 20 to 30 individuals in a given day. Well, if I want to reach out to each of those people, let's call it 10 times on average before I give up, well, then 8 times 10 is 80. That's 80 activities per account, okay? So let's say that I can do 40 activities a day to make the math easy. What that means is like if I'm going to reach out to a given account 80 times in it, let's just say in a year, because let's say I reach out those 80 times, I get nothing back. I'm not going to call them back 6 months later. Maybe I will, but let's say that I don't. All right, so then basically if I can do 40 calls a day, then I can get through one account in 2 days. There's like 233 working days in a year. So, okay, like let's just call that 230 for easier math. So that means that if it takes me 2 days to get through an account, then I can work 115 accounts. And there's your number. And that's kind of like actually about what the math ended up being at. Like my territory fluctuated between like 60 and 180 accounts at any one point in time, depending on, I was there for 3 years, so it really fluctuated a lot. And when I had 180 accounts, like I couldn't call everybody. I just couldn't do it. So if you can land on that number and say, all right, like let's call it 115, now we can get really narrowly focused on our ICP. And let's say that we've got 10 sales reps. So it's not 115 per rep. And I was an AE, not an SDR. So you could maybe double those numbers for an SDR. 115 times 10 AEs, let's call that, let's just round to 1,000. So we've got 1,000 accounts that we want to call in. Now, there's a question of whether we're account-based or whether we're just like individual-based, but 1,000 accounts. What data points can we find to identify those 1,000 accounts? Maybe what we do is we actually identify 1,500 and then give those to the reps and say, why don't you guys narrow this down to 1,000? You can go to the websites and poke around. We're not giving you 1,000 accounts for each rep and expect you to go to 1,000 websites. We'll give you 150, and then you can go to each one of them and you can manually research that website and you can start to determine whether or not this is a fit. Lots of use cases for AI tools here as well, right? There's a lot of powerful things we can do, but at least every sales job I ever had, granted I started this company almost 10 years ago, so it's been a while since I've been on the front lines. I just get this like dump of accounts and I'm like trying to figure out who to call. And it's just like a really, really inefficient use of sales time.
And this like account capacity thing is so important, especially when your SDR team isn't performing as well as you want them to, because if you have no idea what your capacity is and they are way, way over capacity, not only are they not even touching a lot of those accounts, but the accounts they do touch, they're probably rushing through it and skipping so many steps in their sales process or not giving them the attention that they need. And also, if they're so over capacity, do they even know what their best accounts are in that list? Do they have their like the top accounts that they need to be focusing the most on? And are those accounts even enriched if this work hasn't been done at all?
Well, I mean, this is the exact process we would go through at Salesforce. So I would get like my 60 accounts or 100 accounts or whatever it was. And like, your first like day in territory, you're going through all those accounts. You're trying to look at the past history and you're trying to stack rank them. Here's my tier ones. I'm going to pick 10 tier ones. I'm going to pick 20 tier twos and 30 of them are going to be tier threes, right? Now I can do that because I got 60 accounts or 100 accounts. There's just no way to do that with 1,000 accounts unless I'm just using tools. So I think that that's a really, really big unlock for go-to-market. And a lot of organizations that don't have a go-to-market engine that's as mature as what I'm describing at Salesforce, this is the first thing that I would do to try to improve outbound is just like, how do I get my reps focused on the best possible accounts? It's a very simple question. But I think like the way that we've ordered this in our go-to-market efficiency pyramid, I always question whether this is out of sync because it's like, you can't figure out the capacity until you figured out the process. So if I'm selling like a highly transactional product, like you had Kyle Norton on the podcast, and he was selling at owner.com, they're selling a solution to mom and pop restaurants, right? So I imagine, I have no idea, but like if I had to guess, I'm guessing like they're selling something for $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, whatever, like very, very transactional, super fast sales cycle. It's probably not going to be the same sales process that I had at Salesforce. Like how different is one restaurant to another? Like I don't know owner.com's product, but like, does it matter if they're serving Thai food or Italian food? Maybe it matters what their price point is. I have no idea, but I could see how the sales process might be, okay, we've fed the tool with all this information. All you need to know is that this is a Thai restaurant with 200 tables. And this is the messaging that associates with a restaurant with 200 tables. And it just benefits you to know that it's a Thai restaurant because the person running a Thai restaurant probably cares that you know it's a Thai restaurant. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but like, I don't know how that's different for the solution selling, right? So you might say, okay, the process is that you pull up this information in Apollo or Salesforce or whatever, you look at it for 5 seconds and you pick up the phone and call. I could very easily imagine this being like heavy on calling. So now the restaurant owner answers the phone. You're like, hey, Mr. Restaurant Owner, I know you have like 200 tables in your restaurant. I imagine maybe you're using XYZ solution and this might be your problem. Boom. Okay. I can do all of that in like 30 seconds. That's very different from what I did at Salesforce, where I might spend like 20, 30 minutes, an hour researching a website because I'm only covering 100 accounts in a year anyway. So if I spend 3 hours before I send my first email, everybody thinks this is crazy, but that's 3 hours that's going to serve me for the next 80 activities. So that's a perfectly reasonable process. So we have to define that process in order to identify what our capacity is. And if our process is that the rep spends 30 seconds reading some like information that we've piped into like whatever tools they're using, then fine. If that process works, then we're going to have a lot bigger capacity. And now with all the AI tools out there, there's a lot greater capability to do that kind of thing, even when you have like really personalized messaging. But you have to really think through what that is and how long it's going to take to execute that process.
And this is such an important point for anyone listening. Like, we can give you, these playbooks and all this advice, but you need to take it and look at it through the lens of your own company. Nothing is going to be cookie cutter. There's not like one way to do something that's going to work perfectly across every single company in every single industry. So just like take the core of what we're saying and, the ideas behind it and the curiosity and like looking into your sales process and your systems, but make sure you're also doing the work to see what works for your company. And me, Kyle Norton, we talked a lot about this on my podcast with him. And, the things that he did to discover specific things that worked for his salespeople, they were completely different than, the best practices that exist for sales. And he increased their win rate from 38% to 53% in a single quarter from doing that. So absolutely, test things, be curious about your own company, and make sure you're doing what's right for your business.
Yeah. And I mean, my biggest takeaway from listening to that podcast and reading the newsletter you wrote up on it is like, how do they go from 38% to 53% win rate? Or specifically like, why are these behaviors that they identified with their AI call scoring so valuable to them and so different? It's like the way that you kind of like position this is that, Kyle imagined that it would be discovery skills, right? Like everybody thinks like, well, how do you improve your close rates? Like you do better discovery. That's just like sales 101. But they're selling a highly transactional product to a mom and pop business. So with that context, maybe hindsight's 2020 when I read through this and you're saying like, ask for the sale, make sure you have clear next steps, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about driving that momentum. I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. If I'm selling a relatively inexpensive solution to a mom and pop business, the sales cycle is super short. It's all about maintaining that momentum. That makes perfect sense. I can't go and take that playbook and then go apply it to like enterprise SaaS where we're trying to sell like a $500,000 software solution to a Fortune 500 company and expect that to work.
And I want to quickly disclaimer here. I don't remember for sure if it's just mom and pop restaurants. I just know that I remember that they were restaurants, but in case Kyle's listening to this and he's like, what? No.
And maybe we're doing a disservice to them. And maybe, and I've seen this so many times with so many customers, they'll come to us and be like, yeah, we have this software solution we sell to mom and pop restaurants. And then we have this enterprise team over here where we're trying to sell to like all the franchises or chains across the country. And that's a completely different sales process.
Yep. And then again, with that different sales process, you got to look back at your ICP and your buyer persona because those might be completely different people, and you might need completely different, documents and processes that your reps follow. And then also based on product, you have different products for these different industries. What is the sales process for this specific product? So you can get really, really granular with your segmentation here, and you should. So let's talk about the CRM and the reporting side of this a little bit. If a CRO wanted to pull up a dashboard tomorrow morning and get a read on how their SDR team is actually performing, what should be on that dashboard?
So I think there's a set of reports that are kind of like basic and obvious and the same for everybody. And then there's a set of reports that are unique and different for everybody. So I'll start with kind of the standardized stuff. Obviously, we want to look at call activity, meeting set, qualified pipeline generated, and then of course, closed won revenue. Now, like this is pretty basic and obvious, but there are unfortunately a lot of SDR teams that are only looking at meeting set and they're not looking at qualified pipeline, or they're only looking at qualified pipeline and not looking at closed won business. And I think that not only is a big disservice to the revenue team or the company, it's also a big disservice to the SDR. And this is why I think a lot of SDRs fail when they become AEs, because they get trained to think like, my job is to set a meeting, as opposed to my job is to set a meeting that turns into revenue. And there's a big distinction between the two things. It's similar to like the MQL. If we have a dashboard, we just want to see across the team, like, is everybody logging their activity? Is everybody setting enough meetings? Are they generating enough pipeline? And by pipeline, I mean qualified sales opportunities. So for example, when I was at Salesforce, we would call these a stage 2 opportunity. So the SDR, on the rare occasion that I got a lead from an SDR, would pass it over to me and it would be in stage 1, and I would have to move it to stage 2 before the SDR would get credit. Now, the really nice thing at Salesforce is about 90% of the time I would move it over to stage 2 because it was like genuinely qualified, because like they were really well trained and they knew what they were doing. And then of course you have revenue, right? But then you get into the nuance, okay? And this is where I think it's unique to each organization. I'm a really big fan of account base. So if we say, well, we really want to target accounts and not just contacts, then I'm a big fan of a report that shows a set of named accounts and how they're moving through the funnel. So let's go back to that example we had where we say we have 1,000 named accounts that we have carefully curated with all the tools that we can come up with. Maybe we even stack them out like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And then we want to say, okay, of those 1,000 accounts, how many of those are sitting in like, and we actually have like account stages in our Salesforce. And I think our first stage is called like just new or target. So how many of those 1,000 accounts are just new or target? We built some automation in our own Salesforce. Like the second that we send out like an activity, it moves to working. Okay, so how many of those accounts are in working? The second that somebody responds to us, that moves to engaged. Or no, not responded, set a meeting. And that's just because of like the automation. It's just easier. So we get a meeting with somebody, now we're engaged. Then we create an opportunity that's an open opportunity. And then they either become a customer or they become stale. We can have a report that shows how we're moving those accounts through, and we can look at each individual rep and how they're moving those accounts through. But this is all premised on the idea that A, we want to do account-based, and B, we want to do like a named account set instead of just saying, yeah, we're account-based, but we're like going after like 100,000 accounts. Another thing you might want to look at is like, what stakeholders are we going after? So when I was at Salesforce had figured this out. Top performing reps would call into the C-suite, and bottom performing reps would call into like the Salesforce admin and the more junior people in the organization. So we tracked this. We literally had a button that said like calling into power and not power or whatever. And ironically, like people would actually like put in accurate data in Salesforce, and you'd see all these like bottom performing reps with like 30, 40 calls in a day, all to like not power. And then you'd see all the top performing reps that made like 5 calls that day, all to power. And you're like, okay, this person made 5 calls and they're crushing the leaderboard because they're talking to the right person about the right thing in the right accounts. So those are really big things. You know, and I don't know if we're only talking about outbound on this podcast or inbound, but like on inbound, obviously like speed to lead is paramount. How fast are we responding to these new leads, especially hand raisers? And then for both of them, like how many activities are we doing before we give up on an individual contact or account? This is something I'm really big on. I've seen so many reports where somebody says, oh, we passed these MQLs over to sales, or these cold prospects and they worked them and like they're not qualified and they moved on. And I like dig into Salesforce and I look at it and I'm like, you called them twice. You called them once, you waited 2 weeks, then you called them a second time and you're like, I can't get a response from them. Like that is not adequate. I've never seen an organization that sells effectively that way. Maybe for one organization, it's 10 touches. Maybe it's 15 for another or whatever. Maybe it's 5. I'm okay with 5 if we're talking about like 5 individual separate instances of reaching out with maybe a voicemail, an email, whatever. 5 might be enough, but 2 is not enough. And I see this all the time. So I think those are some of the things that I would want to look at. You also have, of course, like intent signals and trigger-based, signals, things like this. So like you might want to incorporate that in and you say, okay, well, every single time like an organization hires a new CRO, we want to call them, 10 times. Okay, well then we probably want to have a report for that. Like there's an expression, inspect what you expect. Ultimately, the reports need to be, what do I expect my team to do every day? And do the reports tell me whether my team is doing that or not, A? And B, do the reports tell me whether that's working or not, as in like generating pipeline that results in closed won deals? Those are the most important things for me.
So how much of this can a RevOps team realistically build and maintain on their own versus where do they usually need some outside help?
I mean, whether or not they need outside help is just a function of like their bandwidth and their expertise. But in terms of like the capability to build everything we're talking about, there's absolutely no reason that RevOps can't do 99% of this. If I'm a CRO and I'm trying to build this out, I'm going to have RevOps do all of this work and I'm going to have them take it to the 2-yard line and then hand it over to sales and say, look, we figured out your capacity, your territory. We enriched accounts with Clay and Zoom Info and every other tool on the planet that we could think of that would give us accurate data. We've built out the system. Here's the step-by-step process. We gave you some email templates to start off with, some call scripts to start off with. We've given you everything on a silver platter. Now your job is to potentially, for example, log into the website and validate that this is a good account, disqualified if it's not, whatever. You're only doing the things that RevOps can't do because it's not RevOps' job to go account by account by account. Now, I would put a hard sales pitch into like hiring admins, like as in like a virtual assistant overseas or an executive assistant. I have both and they are worth their weight in gold. I know not everybody's going to buy into that because like everything needs to be software and AI. Like we're not spending money on assistants for our salespeople, but it's just insane to me because like an AE with $1 million quota and spending 1/3 of their time selling is selling $1,500 an hour. And you can go hire a virtual assistant overseas for like in the range of $10 an hour. It's like, why would you not do that? Or we've had like folks on our team that in past roles running RevOps that have like hired whole teams in India to go like manually like scour accounts. Like there's incredible value in that if you can take it to the 2-yard line and then get like a human to take it maybe to the 1-yard line and then hand it over to sales. We should be doing everything possible for sales reps to get them to spend as much of their time as possible just focused on trying to sell into the right accounts. That is like the biggest unlock we can do for the SDR team.
So if you could leave listeners with one thing to go check to fix in their SDR process this week, what would it be?
Oh, it's a tough one because we're going to refresh this. But this week, check out the Modern Outbound Framework, which is also part of our go-to-market efficiency pyramid, which is going to be updated in the next few weeks. So go check that out on our website right now, or maybe it'll be updated before this podcast is published.
I was just about to say, it might be, yeah.
All right. Either way, check the links in the show notes for that, and then make sure you subscribe so that you will get the updated versions of these in your inbox when we release them.
Absolutely. And newsletters also.
Oh, yeah.
That's very fun. All right, Eddie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. This is fun as always. Thanks for listening to the episode. If this resonated, please give us a 5-star rating and a follow. It helps us reach more people, and you get our latest and greatest content without having to search for it. And if you're looking for hands-on help in go-to-market strategy and/or RevOps, please reach out to us. We help our clients with everything from annual planning to improving processes in go-to-market, implementing systems to support those processes, and go-to-market AI. We're always happy to offer a free consultation to help you identify the best opportunities to improve your go-to-market engine with or without our help. You can find us at unionsquareconsulting.com, and the info will be in our show notes.